Professor Omer Bartov, thank you very much for joining our interview series.
Thank you for having me.
Let me start right away with the first question. Given your extensive work on the complexities of defining genocide and the centrality of intent, how should we evaluate the Israeli military campaign and mass killings in Gaza through the lens of genocide studies, particularly when patterns of indiscriminate force, dehumanizing rhetoric, and systemic targeting of civilians are framed by the Netanyahu government as necessary and legitimate acts of self-defense?
Well, thank you for that question. First of all, the most important thing to understand when you try to determine whether genocide is happening is that you need to show that there's an intent to destroy a particular group in whole or in part as such, and that intent is being implemented. Now, all regimes that carry out genocide or organizations that carry out genocide will usually try to use some other rhetoric. They will say that this is a security risk, that they have no choice, that wars are terrible and you have to do terrible things in war and so forth. So you have to cut through that rhetoric and to see whether there is an intent, whether you can establish an intent, and then whether that intent is being implemented on the ground. I concluded that intent was both expressed and then implemented in May of 2024. And the reason was that already in October, immediately after the Hamas attack of October 7th, statements were made by Israeli politicians and generals that appeared to have a genocidal content that spoke about flattening Gaza, cutting off water, food, and energy, that nobody was uninvolved, and describing people there as human animals. But the government also then declared that its war goals were to destroy Hamas and to release the hostages. And that seemed to be a more limited kind of objective. By May, it appeared to me that what the IDF was doing was not implementing those expressed war goals, but rather exactly what had been said in the immediate aftermath of October 7th. That is, that it was engaged in a systematic destruction of Gaza, deliberate destruction of Gaza, whose goal was to make it uninhabitable for its population. And that became clear in May, because in May, the IDF moved to Rafah, ordered the population, 1 million people who were there, most of whom had been already displaced at least once, many times, by the IDF, and moved them to the Mawasi area, the beach area, without any sort of humanitarian infrastructure, and then proceeded to destroy Rafah. And that seemed to show that the pattern of operations, which is another way of determining whether you're seeing genocide or not, the pattern of operations was to make not only Gaza uninhabitable by destroying it, but also destroying everything from, as we know now, there's a new report, of course, by Physicians for Human Rights in Israel, deliberately destroying the health services, deliberately destroying universities and schools, deliberately destroying mosques. So destroying everything that would make it possible for a population to take care of its health, to be educated, and to reconstitute itself as a group subsequently once the violence stops, if it ever does. So that's a conclusion that I reached already in May of 2024. I wrote about it in August that year. But since then, of course, we've seen much more evidence of this and many more expressions of an intent for ethnic cleansing of Gaza, but ethnic cleansing that cannot be accomplished, of course, because there's no place for the population to leave to, and therefore increasingly both killing large numbers of people, creating conditions that make it impossible for them to live, and in fact also, as in one of the subsections of the Genocide Convention, also greatly diminishing the ability to give birth or healthy birth to children because of, among other things, starvation, lack of food, lack of medical services. So, for instance, just as one figure, a growth in 300% of miscarriages among women in Gaza since October 7th.
Right. In your 2023 Guardian op-ed, you described the Israeli far right as increasingly theocratic and exclusionary. How does this ideological shift, when coupled with the populist rhetoric, justify or normalize indiscriminate violence?
So I would say the Israeli government now is the most far-right government that Israel's ever had. And it includes not only Netanyahu and his government, and Netanyahu has become much more extreme himself, as well as a very savvy and cynical politician, but also members of parties that until that coalition was formed in late 2022 were anathema to Israeli politics, were seen to be marginal to Israeli politics. That's the party run by Bezalel Smotrich, who is a settler and is a promoter of that kind of ideology of Jewish supremacy. And Ben Gvir, who comes from another brand that is connected genetically to Rabbi Kahana, who was a Jewish Nazi and who was banned at the time when he was running for the Knesset, who eventually was banned by the Supreme Court from participating in elections. And Ben Gvir is his ideological descendant. So these two people now are the two most powerful ministers in Netanyahu's government. But I would add to that alongside these people who are religious fanatics and who are anti-democratic and who are racist, there are also other members of the government who are secular, who don't belong to that, and yet are also very extreme in their views. The current Minister of Defense, for instance, Israel Katz, has spoken openly of creating what he calls a humanitarian city over the ruins of Rafah, which in fact would be a vast concentration camp into which initially about 600,000 Palestinians supposedly would be crammed, those who were last year sent off to the Mawasi area, and they would be able to leave it only if they left the Gaza Strip altogether. So these individuals, including Levin, who is the Minister of Justice, they're very extreme, both in terms of changing the political system in Israel and in the treatment of Palestinians, and yet they're not part of that other side, the sort of religious messianic fanatics.
Right. In your article, Israel's War in Gaza and the Question of Genocide, 2025, you argue that Israeli policies in Gaza are shaped by settler-colonial logic and a dehumanizing view of Palestinians, often perceived by many Israelis as a collective threat. In the light of Hamas' October 7 massacre, how should we interpret the moral and legal boundaries of state response, especially when that attack is used to legitimize large-scale military campaigns that may constitute genocide?
So look, I mean, there are, I think, two levels here that you need to think about. One is what most people who are trying to defend Israel would like to forget, that the Hamas attack of October 7th, however heinous it was, and to my mind, it was a massacre, it was a war crime, and it was a crime against humanity. However, we should not condone the nature of that attack, came within a context. And that context is the context, first of all, of the siege of Gaza that went on for 16 years by Israel since Hamas took over, and the occupation of Palestinians more generally since 1967 for most of the existence of the State of Israel. I was 12 when Israel won the 1967 war and began the occupation. That's occupation, by the way, most of the Palestinians who were living then in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank were people or descendants of people who had been expelled from Israel in 1948. So they'd already become refugees. Now I'm 71, so it's most of my lifetime that Israel has occupied those people. When you occupy large numbers of people, and there are equal numbers of Jews and Palestinians between the river and the sea, then this has a dehumanizing effect on both sides. You know, as the Messezer wrote, it obviously the occupier dehumanizes those they occupy because that's the only way that they can explain to themselves why they have the right to do so. And they too are being dehumanized by that process. So that's a larger context that explains in part why the Israeli public is so indifferent to what is happening in Gaza. But the second, of course, is the attack itself. And the Hamas attack created a sense of trauma and confusion and insecurity within the Israeli public that seemed to justify any kind of response to such an extent. And now there's, I would say, more discussion of that both around the world and even in parts of Israel, to the extent that people were willing to entertain the idea of genocide in response to massacre. Which of course is not only illegal by international law, but is plainly unethical. So the situation that you find yourself in now is that for large parts of the Israeli public, over all those months, it appeared that because of the attack of October 7th, the only guilty party in starving the population, destroying Gaza altogether, killing large numbers of people, were Hamas. And that's a typical dynamic of these kinds of situations. Usually, organizations carrying out genocide and the public that supports them sees their victims as the main perpetrators. That's a very common aspect of genocide, and that is what we're seeing now in Israel.
Right. Two prominent Israeli human rights organizations, B'Tselem and Physicians for Human Rights, which you have just referred, recently reported that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza by targeting civilians based solely on their Palestinian identity, causing severe and in some cases irreparable harm to Gazan society. As a genocide scholar, could you evaluate how such assessments reinforce or complicate international legal debates surrounding intent, proportionality, and the criteria for defining state violence as genocide?
So look, first of all, what is important to point out is that both the B'Tselem report, which I was reading drafts of over the last few weeks, and Physicians for Human Rights in Israel, these are Israeli NGOs, and it's the first time that Israeli NGOs made up of Israeli physicians, scholars, legal scholars, have said openly with a huge amount of evidence that what they're seeing is genocide. And they make slightly different arguments, but it comes down to the same thing. That as such is very important because this is coming from within Israeli society itself. The debate of whether this is genocide or not, as you know, has gone on for a long time. As I wrote in the New York Times, I think that there is a growing consensus among both scholars of genocide and legal scholars that this is genocide. It's true that it's often not easy to identify genocide. And it's also true that if the debate is only over whether this is genocide or not, then there may be a tendency to forget that even if we are not sure whether what we're watching is genocide or not, there are clearly war crimes and crimes against humanity being carried out on a daily basis. So it may even divert attention from the criminality of the war because one is still tinkering with this question, is it genocide or not? But by now, I think intentionality is clearly there. In fact, one curious aspect of this event is that intentions were declared very early on, and that's not always the case. The question was whether these declared intentions were being implemented. And as I said, that to me became clear well over a year ago, right? In May last year. And by now, I think, when we see what the IDF tried to do between October and January, which was to ethnically cleanse northern Gaza and north of the Netzarim corridor, and what it is now focused on since it broke the ceasefire in March, both starving the population, but not simply starving the population without intent, but starving the population so as to force it also to move to the south. And that was the point, first of all, of not providing food in the north so that people would leave. And secondly, when finally these distribution points were created, these 4 distribution points, 3 of them were in the south, with the intention of drawing people to the south so as to concentrate them for the next move, which would be to push them out altogether. So I think that these reports add to that. I would say that the report by Physicians for Human Rights is valuable in addition to the B'Tselem report, because it shows for the first time clearly that there was a deliberate destruction of the entire healthcare system in Gaza, and that even more so than the famine that is going on now, will have long-term repercussions. It'll be very hard to rebuild it, if ever, and the consequences for the life and health of the population will be very long-term. And so it speaks about sort of slow-moving genocide, among other things, explaining why, as they understand it, the Israeli government refrained from killing larger numbers of people that might have brought more public attention and international pressure on Israel, but rather doing it in a more slow version that is more difficult to prove, at least while it is happening. So you can see a tactic here, and a deliberate one, to make life impossible in Gaza for its Palestinian population.
Right. In your 2021 article, Blind Spots of Genocide, you critique the Western-centric orientation of genocide studies and call for the inclusion of settler-colonial violence and victim perspectives. How should this framework be revised to more accurately reflect the dynamics of Israeli state violence in Gaza? Moreover, how does the international community's muted response to this violence, especially in contrast to its swift condemnation of Hamas' October 7 massacre, highlight enduring asymmetries in how global discourse defines and recognizes victimhood and perpetration?
Well, yeah, there's a lot in your question, so I'll focus on at least part of it, which I think is the most crucial part right now, or maybe 2 parts of it. The first is that it is absolutely extraordinary that since October 7th, Israel has had complete impunity in its actions in Gaza, and of course also in the West Bank that we can talk about in a moment. Absolute impunity, and not simply impunity in the sense that nobody does anything to stop it, but both massive military assistance. The Israeli IDF could not have done any of that without constant supply of arms and munitions by the United States, but also by European allies, not least Germany, which is the second largest supplier of arms to Israel, and major diplomatic cover. That Israel is living under a diplomatic Iron Dome, that the United States, as a permanent member of the Security Council, will veto any attempt to sanction Israel for its actions. And this is extraordinary because the countries that are facilitating Israel's actions in Gaza are the countries that are most clearly identified as those who protect the rule of international law and human rights. That's how they describe themselves. And that Israel is not Syria or Russia or China or Somalia. Israel is a country that is described by itself and by its allies as the only democracy in the Middle East, as the protector of human rights. And so it is an exceptional case that is exceptionally supported by the very defenders of the kind of rules, the kind of regime of international law that Israel is in severe breach of. And that's an extraordinary situation. There are reasons for this, and they are somewhat complex, but that is the reality of it. The second thing is, of course, that why is Israel doing what it is doing? So Israel is doing what it is doing because I would say until October 7th, Netanyahu had managed to persuade most of the Israeli public, and in fact, most of the international community, that Israel could, so to speak, manage the occupation. That there was no need for any territorial compromise or anything else because the occupation can be managed. And the way he did it, in part, was by supporting Hamas. And we tend to forget that Hamas was seen by the Israeli right, by people like Smotrich, but very much by Netanyahu himself as an asset. And Israel persuaded Qatar to provide millions of dollars to Hamas, which were handed over in big money bags by Israelis to Hamas, which used a fair amount of that money, in fact, to build its tunnels. So the theory was it's great to have Hamas because Hamas is seen in the rest of the world as a terrorist organization, as a fundamentalist organization, which wants to replace Israel with the Islamic State. And therefore, it's not a part for negotiations. Whereas the PA, well, it's recognized around the world, that's not good for Israel, but it's also very weak and corrupt, and therefore Israel has no reason to worry. Quite apart from the fact that it's collaborating, of course, with Israel in the West Bank. Now, that blew up on October 7th when Hamas attacked. And so the question is, initially, the Israeli government and the military were quite shocked by that, and it took them a few days to recover. And then people like Netanyahu, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, suddenly realized in their minds that this was an opportunity rather than simply a fiasco. And they saw this as an opportunity to solve the issue in different ways. If they can't manage the occupation, well, then they better ethnically cleanse the population and use the kind of consensus around the world of Israel having been attacked and hundreds of Israeli civilians massacred as an excuse now to solve the problem. But for Netanyahu, of course, there is a dilemma. And the dilemma is that if, as he says, he needs absolute victory, total victory, what does that total victory mean? If Hamas is gone from Gaza, who takes over Gaza? Who would rule over Gaza? The IDF does not want to do it for good reasons. It's too expensive in blood and treasure. It would be impossible. So who would do it? And the natural choice would be the Palestinian Authority, maybe a different version of it, but it has to be ruled by Palestinians. And that would defeat the entire purpose of this government, which is to divide between Gaza and the West Bank, complete the operation in Gaza, and then accelerate the creeping ethnic cleansing of the West Bank. So this is the situation that we're here now. The dynamic that this government wants to push is to complete the ethnic cleansing and to the extent that they can do it, annexation of territories in Gaza and in the West Bank.
Right. In your New York Times and Guardian commentaries, you warn against the instrumentalization of Holocaust memory as a means of shielding the Netanyahu regime from accountability. How has the Israeli far right, particularly figures like Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir, invoked Holocaust analogies to deflect allegations of war crimes and genocide in Gaza?
So I want to tell you that it's not only the far right in Israel that uses these analogies. This is much wider. There's in fact almost a consensus in Israeli society going from the left to the far right. And this is a long process. I would say that the use of the Holocaust as a kind of both unifying memory for Israeli society and a license to exercise extreme violence against anyone perceived to resist Israeli rule and Israeli occupation accelerated, especially in the late 70s and early 1980s. You will remember that Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, the first right-wing prime minister in Israel and a disciple of Zev Jabotinsky, in 1982, after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, spoke about Arafat, who was then in Beirut, as hunkering down in his bunker like Hitler in Berlin in World War II. So these kind of associations between Palestinians, the PLO, Hamas, as Nazis, part of the fabric of Israeli politics. If you listen to Israeli media, mainstream Israeli media, which never shows pictures of the horrors of Gaza, they always refer to Hamas as Nazis. So that triggers in the Israeli public a sense that this is a danger, an existential danger, therefore that Auschwitz is around the corner. And if Auschwitz is around the corner, then Israel should do everything it can to prevent that and to destroy its enemies entirely. And to hell with what the international community says, to hell with any international law, we are fighting for our very existence. That's the kind of mechanism that was perfected. To that, Netanyahu added a very important element, which is this sort of weaponization of threats of anti-Semitism, so that any protest against Israel, and it doesn't matter if these are Jewish students on American campuses protesting against the horrors of Gaza, is immediately defined as anti-Semitism. And he has succeeded in doing that to the extent that both in Europe, as you know, certainly in Germany and in America, there has been a clampdown on these protests in the name of fighting anti-Semitism.
Right. In Blind Spots of Genocide, you stress the need to center victims' perspectives. In Gaza, how do Israeli media censorship and the framing of all Gazans as Hamas obscure or erase civilian experiences?
Well, it does, of course. But again, I want to say, when you say censorship, you are being kind. Because on mainstream, say on the public TV channel, Kan 11, there is no censorship. There's military censorship. They can't reveal various things, but they have every right to report about what's happening to Palestinians in Gaza. They don't do it out of self-censorship. And self-censorship is a much more effective mechanism that has existed in the Israeli media for a long time. This, again, I mean, my father was a journalist, and I remember that kind of self-censorship since I was a child under Labor governments. This was not invented today. But by now, at this point, it's extraordinary the amount of both self-censorship and mobilization of the entire spectrum of the Israeli media, with two very small but important exceptions, with the Haaretz newspaper, which is very bravely reporting. In fact, some of the best reporting on the war in Gaza is coming from the Haaretz newspaper itself, and Local Core, or Plus 972, which is an even smaller group of intrepid reporters. But by and large, this is not censorship. This is self-censorship and self-mobilization. And that's something that is much more difficult to fight against. In part, it has to do, as everything does in the world today, with ratings. They don't want to annoy their own listeners by saying things that the listeners don't want to hear. But in part, it's that they themselves have bought into the narrative. And while they may not be that supportive of Netanyahu, and certainly not that supportive of the far-right elements in his government, they generally see this as a just war. And they generally see the killing in Gaza as, at best, lamentable collateral damage. And that's a much worse situation than the kind of censorship that you could remove by changing the government.
Right. And lastly, Professor Bartov, in between integrated and First-Person History 2021, you advocate for incorporating personal narratives. How might first-person Palestinian accounts reshape dominant narratives about the Gaza war and its moral consequences?
So about the Gaza war itself, I think there are. I mean, look, it's deeply tragic because so many of the reports that have come out of Gaza are not only heartbreaking. Often these are reports by people who soon thereafter were themselves killed. But I think these reports are having an effect increasingly around the world. Clearly, there is a strong attempt, well, maybe not attempt, but the international media, which is not allowed into Gaza, has accepted this kind of lack of reporting, has not pressed sufficiently to provide objective media reports from events in Gaza itself, and generally has not paid that much attention to what's going on there. This has changed a little bit now because of the famine, and as happens in many genocides in the past and many other kinds of war crimes, there's a moment at which some images will begin to change public perceptions and raise public interest around the world. This happened in the war in the former Yugoslavia. If you remember, with the pictures of those Bosniaks behind barbed wire. It happened during the Vietnam War with the photo of the girl burned by napalm. And so these pictures that have come out now of starving children have had an effect, which is a different kind of narration, right? It's at least you see the people themselves, you see what is happening to obviously innocent children. You can't sell that as anything but what it is. I think in the future, I read several texts of that kind by people who were there and who fortunately managed to get out and wrote accounts. And as a big believer in first-person accounts that tell you what you will never hear, never understand if you look only at documentation from the top, but if you hear people's own experience, I think there will be more of them. And I think eventually our understanding of what is going on, and once it's over, what had gone on, will greatly deepen, and the horror will be shown to have been even greater than what we could have imagined.
Professor Omer Bartov, thank you so very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks very much.